War has been a hot topic lately, with ISIS going crazy, Obama requesting to get Congress's authorization to go to war, and American Sniper coming out. Everybody's kind of been talking about war and all these things. So I wanted to educate myself a bit more about it. I decided to read this book, War by Other Means by John Yoo, an insider's account of the War on Terror. John Yoo is a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. From 2001 to 2003, he worked as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice. So I just kind of broke down this book to look at his arguments, to get, to educate myself more on what exactly the arguments are of people within the Bush administration, to see if my views are adequate, justified, logical. The first thing I broke down the book in 4 steps. So the first step is, what is the book about? The book is about John Yoo justifying all the things that resulted from 9/11. The invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, Guantanamo Bay, torture, NSA, Patriot Act, all that. All of this, everything he writes in this book is a defense to all those things. What is being said? He makes a lot of interesting points, for sure. I'll read some of them to you. The first thing he talks about is that this is a different kind of war. Because Al-Qaeda isn't a nation, we have to deal with them differently. We have to change, we have to revolutionize our way of thinking about war in order to handle this new threat. So one of the points he makes is deliberately targeting and killing civilians is deeply immoral, violating the core principle of the law of war. That is the targeting of 9/11. They deliberately targeted civilians in order to create terror. Because they're not a nation, they don't have that kind of power to actually wage a war. They just target civilians, which is cowardly, immoral, and wrong, for sure. Nobody is debating that. But just skipping over to the third step for a second, just to talk about that first issue, is it true? Certainly it's true that those acts happened, but what have we done in the past? If you look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, deliberately targeting innocent civilians to cause terror. I mean, that is the negative implication of leading your nation in that type of way. You set an example for others to behave the same way. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, however justified, however you want to think of those nuclear bombs on civilian cities, bottom line is they were attacks on civilians. There was no military bases there. It was just civilian cities, like dropping a bomb on Los Angeles or New York City. In fact, they did it to 2 cities. So that doesn't really have much power when you suggest that it's new, that Al-Qaeda is in creating a new rule for war when we've been doing it for quite a while. Not only that, but we have the firebombings of Dresden. We have the embargo of Iraq, which starved 500,000 civilians to death. And we have shock and awe in Afghanistan. Yes, I think of all the justifications of our attacks recently, shock and awe was probably the most legitimate. But at the same time, what did we do? We just targeted civilians and infrastructure. The whole concept of shock and awe is to destroy infrastructure and create so much chaos in such a small time that the military doesn't, or the military forces, Al-Qaeda doesn't have a chance to respond. But we took the same actions that they took. If we want to be the best country in the world, we also have to be moral leaders. We can't just use the same tactics as our enemy if we want to be better than them. He goes on to say again, to fight a new kind of enemy that has no territory, no population, and no desire to spare innocent civilian life. That is certainly something we have never really cared about too much. So I don't think it's a new concept to wrap your head around. He goes on to say, Al-Qaeda violates every rule and norm developed over the history of war. Flagrant breach by one side of a bargain generally releases the other side from the obligation to observe its end of the bargain. So what he's talking about is there's no reason to treat them morally. There's no reason to apply our rules of justice to them because they broke the rules first, which is just a bad argument. I mean, you can't think of it like that because morality and being a good person and being a good nation isn't about, oh, once they do something bad, then we can do something bad too, because they did it first. It's just terrible. It's just not the kind of logic you'd expect from people we look to as leaders and are making gigantic decisions like whether or not we're going to invade a nation. The next controversial thing he talks about is if it weren't for civil liberties, 9/11 wouldn't have happened. What he basically says is that certain legal restrictions that were imposed on the CIA and the FBI before 9/11 prevented them from catching the terrorists that caused 9/11. So it's kind of a big paragraph. He argues he had no prior flight experience and no apparent interest in becoming a pilot. He held $32,000 in his bank account and with no explanation of its source had traveled to Pakistan and apparently held jihadist beliefs. After 9/11, we learned from French intelligence that he had connections to extreme Islamic groups. We also learned that Moussaoui had met with and received funds from Ramzi bin al-Shibh, one of Al-Qaeda's facilitators. Immigration and Naturalization Services officials detained him on the ground he had overstayed his visa. But FBI headquarters turned down the Minneapolis field office's request for a warrant to search his laptop, computer, and belongings, which had information that could have led to the discovery of the 9/11 plot, all because of concerns about the wall. What he means about the wall is there's a piece of legislation called FISA, which prevented the CIA from communicating with law enforcement about people that they had been tracking, considered terrorists, because there was a fear that they would overstep their bounds and share too much information, because it would be the equivalent of searching somebody without a warrant. Internationally, you don't really have to worry about that so much, but when it comes to people in America, we grant them certain civil liberties, as he refers to them here, which I would consider more just basic human rights. And he says because of that, we lost the opportunity to apprehend these guys. My only that's a good argument. I mean, it's a good argument in the sense that it actually follows logically. But I think that's more of a mistake on the CIA. I mean, he goes on to say that these people, they knew they had connections with other terrorist attacks. They knew these people were plotting something. I mean, I don't think any libertarian or civil libertarian, as he describes them here, basically he's just talking about liberals, people who have a belief in liberalism when it comes to politics. I don't think anybody would have made a fuss about stopping people who are known terrorists, who have committed terrorist attacks in the past and are associated with other terrorists, I mean, I don't think that would have been an issue. Even if it would have been, even if he's right, I think there were many other causes for 9/11 that we should be looking at outside of that narrow right before the actual incident happened. He talks about here, let me find the page, that with the help of Saudi funding, Saudi Arabia, the Reagan administration helped train and arm Mujahideen resistance fighters from many different Arab countries to defeat the Soviets. We trained and funded Osama bin Laden. We knew who he was for years. And we knew he hated us. Not because we were free, not because we wear bikinis at the beach, or not because we, whatever they want to say. It's because the presence of American troops in the Holy Land of Saudi Arabia and that current Arab regimes, which they saw as corrupt and untrue to fundamentalist Islamic principles. We knew that going into it. We knew that going into it. So you're going to fund and train and arm people that you already know are ideologically opposed to you. And you're going to do things that you know are going to piss them off even more. And this was in the 90s. This is before they were even the issue they were now. And it's nothing to do with Islam. It's just religious fanaticism at that level. You can't trust people whose minds are so committed in that way. I mean, maybe trust is the wrong word, but you certainly don't need to fund and arm and train them. We can be tolerant. If you want to have those views, you can entertain whatever view in your mind you want. If you threaten my life, I'm going to kill you. It's self-defense, the only justified violence. This is like feeding a bull, training a bull, beefing it up, and then unleashing it on the world, and then being surprised that it trampled on you. All right? That's the logic we're dealing with. So there's plenty more to talk about in the book, but I don't want this video to go on too long. So the last part of the analysis is what of it? Who cares? Who cares if I'm totally right and he's totally wrong? The main point is we're waging an unjust war. If my arguments are sound, then what we're doing is unjustified. And unjust is a soft word. But what that really means is we're doing something that we have no moral support for. So what do you think that's going to do? It's going to create terrorism. What makes you mad? When you see people get beheaded on the news and people get burned on fire, it makes you mad. It makes you want to kill them. It makes you want to go to war. It makes you feel angry and emotional. Imagine what it must feel like to wake up every day and see a Humvee driving by that has killed your family. A plane in the sky that dropped a bomb and killed your sister, or took your brother's arms, or blew your mother's head off. What kind of emotional response do you think that creates in a citizen? An emotional response way more than I'm sure any of us have ever felt in our lives. And you wonder why this new branch of terrorism, ISIS, has erupted. And don't forget that in Jordan we trained ISIS soldiers, or soldiers who later became ISIS, and when they were part of the Free Syrian Army. We knew there was radical fundamental Islamists fighting against Assad, and we made the same mistake we made when we trained people under Osama bin Laden. This is what creates terrorism. Not only that, it's setting a bad example for the rest of the world. It's showing the rest of the world that it's okay to do the things that we're doing. Ultimately, we're suffering a meaningless loss of life. Now, a lot of people have been suggesting that it's unpatriotic to be against the war and that you don't support your troops if you make these points. But guess what? When you support an unjust war, what happens? You're sending American life to go and die for no reason. You are the one that's unpatriotic when you support something that has no moral justification. You are the ones who are allowing our soldiers to die and their families to be torn apart and for them to come home with mental problems caused by PTSD. What's more patriotic? Keeping our troops out of an unnecessary war, or forcing them to go deeper and deeper into more war? 4 tours, 5 tours, 6 tours. For what? For what? What's better for America? Trillions of dollars of war debt, or having our troops home with us, defending our nation within our borders? That's a question only you can decide. Thanks for watching, guys.